go. Okay, it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Nicholas Pyenson to present our second Q-Mare seminar. Nick is a curator of fossil marine mammals at the National Museum of Natural History, which is part of the Smithsonian Institution. He is also a World Economic Forum scientist and a National Geographic explorer. And as well as curating fossils at the museum, Nick leads an international and diverse team conducting research on the evolution and ecology of marine mammals and a few other things here and there. And he brings together information from fossils, historical records, data from modern ecology, physiology, anatomy. So a really multidisciplinary scientist, which is great. And he's published an impressive body of work. And one of the really cool things about Nick is that he's really skilled at disseminating his science and other people's science through popular articles, videos, artwork, working with artists, and books, including his bestseller, Spying on Whales, which I think we'll talk a little bit about today. Today, Nick will present on the origins and fates of ocean giants, from digital ichthyosaurs to spying on whales. The talk is being recorded, but Nick has asked if we can pause the recording so he can present some tantalizingly embargoed results, which we're all looking forward to, Nick. Thank you very much for joining us, Nick. I'll hand it over straight to you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Aaron. Can you hear me okay? Am I coming through on the other side? Okay, great.
Hear you just good.
So it's so great to, I really appreciate the invitation. Aaron and I have collaborated for a little more than half a decade, but we've known each other longer. We actually crossed paths at the University of British Columbia back in the before times, before I was hired here and before I think Aaron was hired at the Smithsonian as well. So we've known each other for a while. And what's funny is the object I'm holding in the Q-Mare photo there is a 3D print replica of the skull and jaws of a fossil river dolphin relative that Aaron and I and other colleagues described in 2015. And I actually found a little 3D print of Isthminia right here as well. So actually my office is full of little 3D prints like this. And I'll share some more in the course of my talk. I was so inspired to receive the invitation from Aaron because I knew who the leadoff hitter was for the seminar series. And following in Sue Kidwell's steps, well, you can only just follow in those steps. So I'm happy to be number 2 here. But what I want to do is to share a bit more of a synthesis of the work I've done over the last 10 years with a vision towards what I think natural history museums should be about in the 21st century. So there's a very big frame at the end that I'll try to get to. And I'll try to build to that through talking about the research that I've done, mostly in collaboration with colleagues from all around the world. And I will just start. Let's see if I can share. I do want to continue, and I do want to begin. So the title of this talk is The Origin and Fates of Ocean Giants, from digital ichthyosaurs to spying on whales. It's a big scope when you start talking about ichthyosaurs and whales, and we'll get to that in a second. But the essence of the research program that ichthyosaurs and whales bookend nicely the range of timeframes that I think about with the research that I do. And when I say ocean giants, I do mean for the moment marine tetrapods, the ocean giants that once had terrestrial ancestry. Even if we can't know it or identify it, we can strongly infer it. That's different from, say, bony fishes and sharks that are also ocean giants, but don't have that strong terrestrial heritage that canalizes and determines a lot about what they can and can't do in ocean ecosystems. And I really appreciate that the mission of the seminar series is to talk about natural and human-induced changes to ocean ecosystems, because that's another frame that I then apply on top of the taxonomic one, which is talking about the evolutionary origins and then the ecological fates of these organisms, of these ocean giants that are marine tetrapods, because their origins do sit in deep time, evolutionary origins that go back, in some cases, only a few 100,000 years, if we think about sea otters, to hundreds of millions of years when we talk about ichthyosaurs. But then squarely thinking about the role of ocean giants in the Anthropocene, well, we eat them, we love them to death, and they live alongside us in increasingly urbanized oceans. So how we move ahead with these ocean giants that actually have ecological impact is a really important question. It's a question that ties together questions about equity and justice with economics and fisheries, alongside with just basic natural history questions of how ocean ecosystems work and what organisms are the most important for affecting the changes that we see in ocean food webs, changes in productivity, changes that we can infer over deep time, but we really do want to know as the Earth is changing rapidly. So digital ichthyosaurs to spine-on whales. I'm going to bounce back between evolutionary origins and ecological fates. When I mentioned spine-on whales, it's a line. It's actually the title of a book I wrote called Spine-on Whales. And in the book, I use this imagery. I talk about this imagery to start off, and I think it's a convenient starting point because these are the golden plates, golden discs that are affixed to the side of Voyager 1, Voyager 2. And these golden discs record human greetings, sounds of the planet, and alongside with greetings in 55 languages are interlaced the song of humpback whales, which in 1972 was a big deal because they were ethereal and mysterious and we really didn't understand what they meant. We still don't know what they actually mean. We don't know the content, but we do know that it is a song that's only sung by male humpback whales. So it's vocalization that's emitted all around the world globally. Humpbacks sing the world around, and they actually share that information across genetic lines and through time. So whale song has evolved through time, and we can see it as a form of cultural transmission. So what a funny thing that we've put whale song, something that we barely understand, on the sides of interstellar space probes. And it says a lot about our relationship with these ocean giants that is still actually fundamentally mysterious. This is spine-on whales that are looking back at us, a humpback whale in Wilhelmina Bay in Antarctica. And that is just a few moments before we applied a suction cup tag to the backs of one of those humpback whales under no permits, because this is one of the few moments, the less than 1% of the time, that whales have are at the surface where we can actually see them. Otherwise, they're 99% underwater, away from most of our tools of observation, unless you're so lucky as to affix one of these digital tags that in life would have 4 suction cups that you'd place if you're so bold and lucky on the backs of one of these whales to understand and then retrieve that information to understand something about what they do that 99% of the time they're not at the ocean surface. But I'm a paleontologist, and the business I had on one of these Zodiac boats in Wilhelmina Bay was mostly observational. I guess we'll do questions at the end. Aaron, is that how we want to do this? Or do we want to run questions in the course of the talk?
However you want to proceed next.
Let me get through the intro, and then I'll set the frame, and then we can see if that. Ask the question again, because I can't really see how insistent the hand is holding up, but we'll get to that question. So the thing about marine tetrapods is they do have a history. In some cases, we know their history pretty well from the fossil record. And that is so certainly true of whales. They do have a terrestrial ancestry, and we know a lot about it. The other side of that is that this is one of the most remarkable times to study large ocean giants because of the tools that we have at our disposal. And I'll talk in a moment a little bit more about some of these tools. And that includes getting imagery like this one. This is a shot from a drone of 2 humpback whales in Wilhelmina Bay that are using bubble nets to trap and feed on fish and krill. And in doing so, they're using a kind of tool. Again, this is cultural transmission of tool use in humpback whales, which tends to be a funny thing that anthropologists really chafe at, but I think is not so surprising when you consider that they're smart mammals that are exploiting their intelligence in a very complex environment over the course of millions of years. And so they do have a history, and we want to know something about that because that directly informs what they're doing in the world out there today. If you want to know something about their history, coming here, I'm in Washington, D.C. in my office, and if we went about on a 5-minute walk that way, we would be in the Sant Ocean Hall right off the National Mall, and you'd be able to see this skeleton before you. This is the skeleton of a 40-million-year-old whale named Basilosaurus. We can get back into the questions about why it's called Basilosaurus. It's kind of a historical curiosity. This is a good whale to start thinking about the terrestrial origins of whales because it's kind of caught in the middle. If you look all the way back in the back left-hand corner, you can see it has small hind limbs that are actually decoupled from its vertebral column. Those are relics of when whales once lived on land and had weight-bearing hind limbs and really didn't look much like the whales that we know of today. Basilosaurus also looks a lot like the terrestrial mammals that we know much better from other features of its skeleton that I just won't get into detail about. That includes features of the teeth, elbow joints that move. But over time, over millions of years, life in the water has changed whales. And in the course of doing so, they've exploited a lot of innovations to take advantage of the resources available in ocean food webs. And that's what, again, this dialectic of evolutionary origins and ecological consequences is really, I think, some of the most interesting questions to examine with the evolutionary history of not just whales, but other marine tetrapods as well. And so that gets at the biggest frame of all, which is the evolution of marine tetrapods. For over the last 240 million years, different groups of marine tetrapods have returned to the water, so to speak, and become important members of ocean ecosystems from the Mesozoic through the Cenozoic. And in the course of doing so, have achieved one big message: convergence. They've achieved similar morphological solutions across multiple scales of morphology, from the cellular level to the tissue level to entire anatomical complexes like a forelimb, a paddle-shaped forelimb. You see that happening repeatedly over and over again. That's selection at work. That's the power of selection telling us how evolution works. But it happens to happen over the course of 2 mass extinction events and maybe a third one as well. I'll get to that in a moment because that frames the ecological consequences, the fates of ocean giants. So there's convergence, that's a big one. Other evolutionary innovations certainly include the structures that may not preserve so well. Propulsion, for example, there's soft tissue structures related to having a tail fluke, which you see up in panel A of this review paper I wrote with Neil Kelly in 2015. There's different kinds of tail flukes that are achieved both with across whales and ichthyosaurs and mosasaurs. Many other groups surely had exploited tail flukes that either swim like this or up and down. And why we'd see one pattern, not the other, is something worth examining. That's what makes studying marine tetrapods so interesting. In panel E, you can see that many groups have achieved that paddle-shaped fore or hind limb structure, comprised of a lot of the same bones, homologous bones throughout tetrapods, but not always in the same way. Those details are relevant. There was a great paper that was published in Biology Letters about a year ago by some Argentinian scholars that talked about examining the networks of anatomical configurations across marine tetrapods to really understand what's going on with the developmental patterns and whether there's some kind of paddle-shaped structures with the bones that are more likely to happen than not. It's a really important paper. And I'm remiss for not presenting that slide here. And I'll find that paper before we end the seminar, so I can point you in the direction of what truly is cutting edge. So there's anatomical innovations that are both hard and soft tissues. You can also think of size as an evolutionary innovation as well that happens over the spans of millions of years. And I started thinking about this more concretely when Lena Delset, who's in Norway, and she was here as a Fulbright scholar last year, and we collaborated on this paper that was a commentary on a science paper about a giant ichthyosaur from the early Triassic, a whale-sized ichthyosaur that appears to have evolved in the first 3 million years of ichthyosaur evolution. So that's very rapid size evolution. And that just made us think, all right, so what's the big picture here? Ichthyosaurs appear to have achieved their gigantic category of body size relatively quickly in the first 1% of their evolutionary history, which lasted some 120, 140 million years. And across, again, at least one mass extinction event. They died out for mysterious reasons about 94 million years ago. Cetaceans took a lot longer, and that seems to be the mammalian story as well for marine mammals. They have a much longer fuse to achieve gigantism. Why that is, we don't know. And that's such a great mystery, I think, just to encapsulate ichthyosaurs to cetaceans as two bookends for this story. And certainly there's so many lineages in between, but those are the lineages that we know best from the fossil record, where we can actually identify a lot about size evolution. So that's a big frame, that's a big open question. Why do we see these two different patterns of rapid achievement of large body size and prolonged sort of a delayed fuse? Still an open question. And of course, going back to ecological fates, we were cheeky enough to use the asterisk on today at 0. There's pretty good evidence we are human-induced extinction events are what's happening today. Are these mass extinctions? Is this going to be a future mass extinction? That's really, it's a good intellectual question to wrestle with, but it may not be so relevant to your next door neighbor. And I do want to talk about that more because I think that's, at the end of this talk, I do want to talk about the role that natural history museums play in sharing what we know about these kinds of messages. So gigantism, body size evolution, evolutionary innovations, marine tetrapods. When you do these broad scale comparisons, you actually can pull apart some really interesting patterns that lead to other questions. And of course, for fossils, these are all tied to the actual specimens themselves. That's why we have museum collections here at the Smithsonian. We have some 15,000 fossil marine mammals. And these are some of them here in the hands of former grad student, now Professor Carlos Pareto. He was looking at tooth complexity in cetacean teeth through time. And what's great about fossils, this became a paper that was published in Paleobiology about 5 years ago. Fossils tell us something that we otherwise wouldn't know. And that's one of the many reasons we keep them in trust in natural history museums and museum collections around the world. Because if we don't have these all together, we can't actually address these kinds of questions about, say, for example, how does tooth complexity change in cetaceans through time? In Carlos's hands here, he has some 40 million years of cetacean evolutionary history. And there are some interesting patterns. I won't get into them because they're not really relevant, but it's just a flag to say specimen-based research matters when you're talking about understanding evolutionary origins and ecological fates. And I wanted to share this quick story to get into ocean ecosystems. This is a cast that I came across in the collections a few years ago while working with Ana Valenzuela-Toro, who was a PhD student at UC Santa Cruz until last week. She defended her dissertation and then last night gave a public seminar. She's now Doctora Ana Valenzuela-Toro. I'm so proud for her. And she studies the evolution of pinnipeds. And I came across this cast that was out in the museum collections. And I said, this looks like an elephant seal maxilla. It's a specimen about this big. I should have probably, if I was thinking carefully, I could have actually just gone and brought it over. Now, what was funny about it was, one, it was only a cast and no actual specimen. And then when I looked at the locality tag, I realized, oh, this is from a place where you don't expect any marine mammals whatsoever. It's from the Wabash River near Lafayette, Indiana, in the middle of the continent of North America, which is very, very far from where elephant seals are typically found. Northern elephant seals are found in the North Pacific. Southern elephant seals are mostly limited to the Southern Ocean. And there are extraliminal records. And that's where the story gets interesting, is because clearly the reasons why you'd get maxilla in Indiana probably have to do with an extraliminal record. a very curious elephant seal once got lost somewhere upstream, in this case, going up one of the branches of the Mississippi River. Is it so extraordinary that an elephant seal would, a pelagic marine predator, might get lost in a freshwater river system? Turns out no. There are other extraliminal records of elephant seals getting lost. And for animal migrators that can journey over thousands of kilometers, maybe it's not such a hard thing to do a few extra 1,000 kilometers upstream. Now, what's really interesting about this skull is that the reason why it's cast only in the specimen is that the original material was destroyed for radiocarbon dating. And that's a specimen at the Field Museum, was destroyed in the 1970s, the entire maxilla. That was when you need a lot of material to run radiocarbon analyses. The dates that were provided at the time give us an age of about 1,000 years before present. So this is a historical example of an extraliminal record, which makes you start to begin to think, wow, what we see in the fossil record is really just the tip of what is possible ecologically by these organisms that we tend to think have these static distributions based on our knowledge of the modern world. But really, our glimpse is so narrow. And that means our ecological window about what's possible is similarly narrow. But we know better. And so when I think about elephant seals, I also think about what just happened on planet Earth in the last few hundred years. This is an image that was collected by one of Shackleton's crew members, Frank Worsley. And he took this picture in 1917 near the heyday of whaling on South Georgia Island. This is an island halfway between the tip of South America and Africa, volcanic island that at the time in the 1910s and 20s housed over 7 large whaling stations from nations from far away from South Georgia, UK, the Netherlands, Norway. They all had major whaling operations. And the reason why was because whales, large whales like the blue whale in this image, were abundant. So abundant that you couldn't miss them with a harpoon. And it's from that tale of abundance that, this is a story that's extremely familiar to members, I think, of the seminar series. And you probably heard similarly from Sue Kidwell last week, the shifted baselines that we've just experienced in recent human history, that is to say the last few generations, are extraordinary. We do not have a memory of what the abundance of many different kinds of animal groups, and certainly not for the largest predators, because we ate them all. I think, as Jeremy Jackson likes to say, large predators are rare, not for reasons that necessarily have to do with ecology, but more to do with history. They're rare because we ate them all. Or in this case, we harpooned them, largely for margarine. It wasn't really for meat. But you are hard-pressed to find blue whales that were as large as the ones that were harpooned and killed in the 1920s. Reliable records of blue whales well over 100 feet long. That's over 33 meters, approaching 110 feet. Many records of those blue whales. Today, you are hard-pressed to find a blue whale much more than 90 feet long, and you really get a sense of the scale of these organisms right here. But it's not just the scale that we're asking about, it's the abundances. What was the world like when there were many, many more whales, these top predators in ocean ecosystems? We should care because whales are actually incredibly important members of the Southern Ocean food web. We talk about krill being the centerpiece of the Southern Ocean food webs because of their abundance today. There's not that many whales, there's way more krill. There's actually so much krill, there's an entire fishery that's based on sucking up krill from the Southern Ocean and coming up with clever ways to use the raw materials and different ingredients that we may use for medicine, that some we may use for pet food or fertilizer. There is more krill by some estimates in terms of biomass than any other animal biomass on the planet. And so the natural question, I think, for anybody who's interested in historical ecology is, all right, what was it like 100 years ago when there weren't just a few more whales, but many more whales? And the way to think about this is that 99% of the blue whales that were on the planet in 1900 were gone by 1960. Blue whales barely made it out of the 20th century. And even today, there are not that many blue whales left. But these abundances are coming back because of strong conservation measures all throughout the world. So the question was, well, how can we estimate what the world was like before whales were reduced in number? And this is a project that began by compiling the information we can get from these animal-borne recording devices, these tags that are placed on the back of whales, along with drone shots, and then prey mapping where whales are feeding. And we started compiling these numbers about how much whales are eating per day for as many species of large whales as we could, not just the gulp feeding rorquals like blue whales, fin whales, and humpback whales, but also right whales as well. And we brought together 30 co-authors from around the world. And this is work done by Matt Savoca that was published in Nature last November. So by having these data sets integrated, we actually could get numbers on something that was elusive for the basic natural history of large whales, which is how much do whales eat per day? And if you know that number and you know how many whales there are, you can actually go back and calculate and infer how much whales were eating in the past. And that should actually tell you about prey densities in the recent past. And these are the kinds of numbers you get. So you go from A, which is the projection of water filtered, because we know the filter area from morphometric measurements of the mouths of these whales. They have baleen plates, they're all filter feeding. We can get that number. And we can actually calculate how much water should have been filtered either today or in the past. And then how much krill these animals could have eaten and how much iron has been recycled. Because as you saw in the past slide, baleen whales not just feed at the surface, but they also poop. And that injection of iron from their feces into the top levels of the water column is a way of recycling, preventing that suspended nutrients from dropping down in the water column. And that again feeds empowers a very tight loop, the so-called food chain of giants, because you have not just the largest diatoms, but the largest krill and the largest whale species all living in the Southern Ocean. So the numbers are actually insane, because what you get when you start calculating them out, you find that the Southern Ocean was basically in Amazonia in 1900, that we then depleted by reducing the large predators that actually were ecosystem engineers. So we vastly underestimated the role that whales have played prior to whaling in ocean ecosystems. And that was the message in this paper, is that if we let whale populations recover, we might actually also recover not just lost productivity, but some degree of ocean function as well that has been missing, certainly in the Southern Ocean, but probably also in other ocean basins as well. So thinking about the role that these large organisms play in marine ecosystems makes you then, of course, me as a paleontologist, wondering, well, has it always been that way if we go back not just 100 years, but scale it out to millions of years? And so this is where specimen-based research takes another leap. And it is all anchored in this kind of tag data. Again, when you ask these questions about evolutionary origins and ecological fates, it does require you to at least talk to your colleagues and collaborators to understand the kind of data that they're acquiring. Because once you understand what that, and this goes back to sitting on one of these zodiacs as a paleontologist and seeing tag operations happening and understanding the data that goes into them. In another paper that I worked with similar colleagues that was led by Jeremy Goldbogen, who's at Hopkins Marine Lab at Stanford, you can actually work out the allometries, the scaling components related to the efficiency of feeding, whether you're a filter feeder with these large filter feeding whales or single prey eating toothed whales. The two different houses of today's whales are either the filter feeders or the echolocators. Filter feeders bulk feeding, taking out large gulps of a larger superorganism, versus the single prey eaters that are the echolocating whales, toothed whales, which include everything from a harbor porpoise to a killer whale to beaked whales and sperm whales that go after single squid prey items, that massive biomass in the mesopelagic. And so when you look at the scaling components, this paper was trying to answer the question of why whales aren't bigger. If it's so efficient to be either filter feeding whale or a deep diving single prey eating animal with the ability to use biosonar, why aren't they much larger? What are the limits on body size? And it turns out that you do start dramatically for blue whales, which are at the upper limit of being a filter feeder. They could not be larger because of the biomechanic limits. They could not close their mouths rapidly enough around a prey swarm. And to make the most benefit, the trade-off on efficiency is energy in, energy out. There's a lot of drag, and there's also a lot of energy spent in just taking one of those large gulps and filtering out the prey. If the density is not sufficient, it's not worth their time. And that gets at why large filter feeding whales migrate. They migrate vast distances so they can have the largest return on that energy investment. Now, does that answer the same? Are there similar limits for the deep diving toothed whales? And turns out no, but they're probably at the limit for physiological reasons because they're diving deep on a single breath. And that breath holding is actually what's limiting their ability at depth. They probably couldn't be feeding on much bigger prey items because they couldn't dive as long. So by looking at the allometric, the scaling of these organisms, at least today, that provides some insight on how these, I think, as a paleontologist looking at the evolution of these groups, how these groups might have evolved, because they diverged from a common ancestor about 34 million years ago. And the reason we know that is from the fossil record, which again illuminates things that we wouldn't otherwise know. There are fossils that fit right on this allometric curve, and I'm going to show you one in a second. This is Maya bellina, and this is a fossil that Carlos Perito, you saw his hands in the previous image, that's him. This is among the fossils he described in his dissertation, which he published a few years ago. This is a relatively large filter feeding whale that is actually super old for filter feeding whales. It's about 33 million years old. And what's really cool, it had neither teeth nor the anatomical surfaces for baleen. It was probably a suction feeding baleen whale. And what we mean by that, you can look at a phylogeny to help. Maya bellina is that light blue, right? I think I can use my cursor. Maya bellina fits right in here, right around the loss of teeth, because the earliest mysticetes had teeth just like their ancestors. We saw Basilosaurus hanging in the Sant Ocean Hall image. The earliest baleen whales had teeth. And then when we look at today's whales, they don't have teeth. They have a filter feeding apparatus. What gives? What is this transition from having teeth to having filter feeding? A lot of ink has been spilled about this, and we think Maya bellina actually answers the question in part because it says there is a stage in baleen whale evolution when they had neither baleen and neither teeth. And so this fossil actually tells us that tooth loss and filter feeding are two fundamentally different evolutionary processes that are decoupled. This innovation didn't happen, it happened stepwise, but it didn't happen all at the same time. And that's the value of having these kinds of fossils from this time period. Maya bellina is at most 33, 34 million years old. The Oligocene is certainly an interesting time for understanding the start of all these innovations for both baleen whales and toothed whales, along with many of the other marine mammal groups. It just so happens we find a lot more cetacean fossils than we do of other marine mammals, which again tend to be kind of fragmentary. And I think when you're a vertebrate paleontologist, you make a lot out of fragmentary remains. Here's the tail vertebra of a Miocene baleen whale. You hope to get a lot more than just this if you want to be able to test ideas about evolutionary origins and then what it actually may imply for the ecological fates. Okay, I'm just doing a quick time check here to see where I'm at. Okay, I'm not going fast enough, but I think I can accelerate here. Thinking about ecological questions made me realize that there are some places in the world where you can actually say a lot more about the ecology for these large ocean giants in the past, but you have to get lucky. And I was certainly lucky at this site called Cerro Baena in the Atacama Desert of Chile, which we documented with our collaborators all together in a large project that transpired about a decade ago. And you can see in the foreground, beautiful skeletons of large fossil whales. There's 3 of them in the foreground. Every other tarp going off in the distance is another skeleton of a very large whale, which is unusual because again, you just find fragments like this. You don't find complete skeletons together. This is tremendously informative, but it's also presenting an ecological question. What's going on? Why are all these large complete skeletons found by the side of the highway? Here's actually Ana Valenzuela Toro in the foreground with one of the more complete fossil whale skeletons. And this problem actually had a technological solution, which was to 3D scan as many of these fossil whales as possible at high resolution so that we could generate 3D data sets that we could then study back in the lab and start to begin to collect taphonomic data that we otherwise couldn't, because we're actually constrained tremendously logistically. The material at hand had to be removed off site to comply with the needs of a highway expansion company, making room for mining trucks to move up and down through the Atacama. They were complying with national patrimony law, but we had to do our science quickly. It turned out taking 3D scans was part of that solution. And actually, I can bump out of this talk, and let me see if I can share with you very quickly. What's really fun about doing this is that I'll share with you this same image we can see here, and we've put these up on a Smithsonian 3D website, where that same fossil whale that you could see from that vantage view, we can replicate in lab in orthogonal views like this at high resolution. So we can zoom in here and see this original data set made from both laser scans and 3D images. And what's really cool with the tools in the Smithsonian 3D Voyager viewer is you can even take measurements. And I'm going to try to switch on to take measurements. Does this work? So this should be 20 centimeters. Let's see if I can do that. Ooh, 20 centimeters, almost on the dot here. I've done this a few times, but this is a great way of being able to engage with the materials because all these fossil whales from Cerro Baena had to be removed from the site. And a lot of them have remained not entirely studied. So it's a legacy project for many others to work on in the future. And I think that's a good thing. We did answer the question of what was going on along the highway. And we think that the best explanation for what was, for why so many fossil whales were found there was harmful algal blooms that killed repeatedly these large whales and other marine mammals in the Atacama of Chile in the late Miocene. And so that's a modern phenomenon. Harmful algal blooms will kill large ocean predators today, but it was also happening in the Miocene. And that was the first time that somebody had demonstrated that. And so you can walk through the logic of how we discovered that by going to this webpage. Now I'll share that link. Actually, I'll go grab that link right now and share that in the chat so everybody else can see that while they're listening to me. Let's see, I'll go back here. Play from current slides. So here, I'll put that in the chat. So Cerro Baena was the way how I kind of first got engaged with 3D scanning. And that led to me to use those techniques to study other fossil marine mammals as well. Now it's a part of the workflow that I do wherever possible to generate 3D data sets, because that's a way of actually enhancing both the durability and usefulness of the materials that we study, allows for broader dissemination, and it helps with archiving and information tracking, and really honestly, scientific transparency. So we're now going to pivot to the part where Aaron should pause his recording, if you will, confirm, because I do want to share, working with Cerro Baena made me think about how are there other instances where these ecological patterns in the past, deep time, are readily visible, and could we use these 3D scanning techniques in the past? Aaron, is it okay to keep on going? Wow. Okay, so I think I just toggled off that image really quickly. So I work at a natural history museum, and our natural history museum happens to have a lot of the world's knowledge about how life on Earth happened, and really how the story of Earth itself, when you consider that we have meteorites and asteroid samples that are older than the Earth itself. So the story of the solar system, the story of life on Earth is recorded in the material remains that we have, that are either digital models that we have 3D prints of, like this little one of that whale skeleton from the Atacama, or the real thing, like this fossil whale vertebra here. We also know that there's incredible challenges today about not just biodiversity loss and climate change, but also how we get the public to engage with the science, the discoveries, but also to know why museums like this exist. And when I was thinking about this a bit more in trying to wrap my mind around what the role of natural history museums should be in the 21st century, I realized that we're a long-term institution. And there are other long-term institutions out there too, that we just might not recognize. And that includes banks, insurance companies, even weather bureaus that compile statistics about the weather. These are long-term institutions that will become really important in the next few decades, and arguably for the next few hundred years, because we have a really narrow time window when we actually can act, knowing what the future will hold in terms of the changes that we're actively mediating on Earth's planetary systems, not just with biodiversity loss, sea level rise, ocean acidification. And so for the Smithsonian, which is here on the National Mall, relatively large campus, which also does have field stations from the equator to the Arctic, I was trying to think more deeply about that legacy and what people did even 100 years ago, 130 years ago. Right across the mall is the Arts and Industries building. And this was actually the original home of the Natural History Museum before this building was created in 1910. In the late 19th century, a lot of fossil whales were stored right in this building, right across the mall. Today it's been restored. It's now an exhibit space. It can't really hold collections. But what's really neat, I was going through some archival images looking for, on Smithsonian Archives, whales at the Smithsonian, and I came across this image. And this is a Gervais beaked whale. It's one of the more mysterious of the species of whales on the planet. Beaked whales dive really deep. They have that, taking advantage of the allometries of their biosonar apparatus. This was a beach pickup, probably off the coast of Delaware or off the coast of Virginia, and brought back to the museum squarely right in front of the Arts and Industries building, which you did back in the day, because that's how we collected, bringing material back to the museum. And this is an archival image from 1883. That's about 130 years ago. And what's amazing, you see all these faces in the foreground, but there are faces of people who have been excluded from participating in natural history museums. I'm thinking about African Americans in particular. Here's the face of a young boy, probably 8, maybe 10 years old, looking up in the top right of the image. And before him is a specimen that we still have in the museum. It's skeleton, not its skin. Today we would take a lot more samples. We'd take genomic collections, we'd take digitized images. We'd want to know as much as possible about this rare opportunity to know about something mysterious. So I think that's where we get to narrative and how we share our discoveries with the public. And my one word of encouragement would be, there are so many different ways to do it. There's so many different modes to share what we know and how we know it, that I really encourage anybody listening out there to the seminar series, if they want to make a difference, they want to be able to persuade people about the value for having natural history museums and collections. The best way is to think about how to sharpen your storytelling techniques. And I've tried to do this not just through writing books, nonfiction, but also writing kids' books. I actually have, that's the back cover of a kid's book about a bowhead whale that lives a very long time, that was published last week with my colleague, Alex Boersma, who co-wrote it and made this wonderful illustration. So I would just say that you don't have to write books. You can do podcasts, you can do digital images. However you choose to express yourself is fine, but there are so many different ways to do that today. I think that's part of our obligation to share what we know with the public. So, and that's one step to becoming a 21st century museum, along with doing as much as we can to document what is precious and before our eyes and quickly disappearing. I can go on, but that's it. Let's pivot maybe for a few questions.
Hey, thanks, Nick. Wonderful talk. Congratulations on the new book.
Yeah, thanks.
It got published last week.
Yeah, following in your footsteps, trying to write a kid's book. Yeah, this was published last week. So
that's great. Congratulations.
Yeah. And this is all the story of a long-lived individual whale and how the world around it changes over the course of 200 years.
Right. So thanks, Nick. Thanks for the talk. It was terrific. I love how you weave your stories together, from evolution to ecology, history, bringing it to people, and the future of marine mammals. It's like, the essential need to house information and communicate that information effectively is great.
Thanks.
Your whole work centers around that kind of ethos. That's fantastic. Okay, let me go back to this. Just to remind you all, thank you all for joining us. Just to remind you all, if you have a question for Nick, you can use the Q&A. You can raise your hand to ask the question yourself. Either way is fine. If you use the Q&A, we'll read it out for you. So go ahead and ask any questions.
I think, oh, Catalina's here. Oh, awesome.
I have a question, Nick.
Oh, Catalina has her hand raised. I'm sure it's
really?
I think, ask me about something I don't know, which are sharks.
Okay, I'm sorry, Catalina.
Can you hear
You
me?
can yeah, you can
Oh,
activate your
great.
microphone.
Thank
Yeah,
you
great.
so much for Aaron for organizing this seminar, and Nick, what a great talk, very inspiring. And I do have a tricky question, but I'm really, really curious about what you have to say about this. And of course, you know, I work with sharks, and to me, it's been very interesting how the pathway into becoming a filter feeder between sharks and whales is somewhat similar in the sense of you know, you come from a predatory ancestor, and then you become a filter feeder. So I'm very curious to see to hear what you think about the fact that whales developed or evolved this very sophisticated apparatus for filter feeding, whereas sharks, they only have tiny teeth. They didn't really develop anything so sophisticated as filter feeders. Have you ever thought about this and why whales went through the trouble of evolving such a sophisticated apparatus?
So, you know, I think we're just at the phase of trying to parse out how do they go from teeth to filter feeding? What are the anatomical steps? It's a bit like how dinosaurs evolved a flight apparatus for flying. You can kind of dissect what you think the steps would be, and then see how the fossil record either tests that idea one way or another. It's tricky because filter feeding in whales happens in different ways, but it probably happens only in several different modes. And none of those modes are actually shared with filter feeding sharks, which use a different filter feeding style entirely, ricochet feeding instead of dead end sieve or cross-flow filtration. So you have, in whales, there's at least 2, if not 3 modes. And in filter feeding sharks, there's an entirely separate mode. So let's just say those modes are comparable and try to understand. I think maybe the easier thing is to understand, when do size get, how quickly do they achieve the kinds of body sizes that may reflect filter feeding? And I don't know if we have a good handle on that with sharks. I know you've written several papers that try to draw inferences from comparative methods, but I think the fossil record is a little unrevealing on the timing for the different lineages of large elasmobranchs. Isn't that right, Catalina, or am I?
Yeah, I mean, there's some ancestral state kind of analysis suggesting that filter feeding occurred independently around the Paleocene and Eocene. In a number of clades, and it evolved from a benthic kind of form. So yeah, perhaps it's something we can discuss and even brainstorm about ways to address this. But I just find it very interesting that this the appearance of filter feeding and such different clades, sharks and whales, and how that's connected with body size and with a transition into a different way of feeding that is associated with giantism. So I just think that it's like an interesting comparison.
I think what I can tell you for sure is that filter feeding and gigantism are not related for whales. You get the evolution of filter feeding before they get really, really large. And that probably happens. We're finishing writing a paper that kind of tries to clarify what we think the time frame is for the origin of a filter feeding apparatus in baleen whales. And it's broad. It's probably about 10 million years. It's between 33 and 23 million years ago. That's just before the early Miocene sort of gap for sharks that we know about. And that is well before we see the acceleration, the really ramping up of large body sizes in baleen whales. In sharks, I don't know if filter feeding and body size are tightly linked. In whales, it's not. And I don't even think that's going to be true in other putative marine tetrapods that are filter feeders. People used to say Shoniosaurus was a filter feeder, but we don't see any evidence for that. We actually think it was probably a single prey item eater, its entire ontogeny. So,
yeah,
there's ontogenetic signals too, because sharks go through different ecologies as they get large. So that complicates things, I think. mammals have
Yeah,
to
that's
suffer.
super interesting. I don't want to take too much time, but so the relationship with the sharks is that the largest shark today, the whale shark, is a filter feeder, and it seems like filter feeding appeared first, and then these gigantic sizes as well. So it's like a pre mechanism into achieving giantism. But anyway, I don't want to take too much time, and I'm sure other people have a lot of questions, but maybe this is like food for thought, and we can further discuss in the future with.
You should write that paper sometime, Kathleen.
Yes.
Okay. Should I take Ian's question here?
Yeah, go for it. Shall I read it out? I'll read the question out for Ian. So Ian Cook-Tapia asks, Nick, when it comes to improving on science communication and outreach projects, in your experience, what have been the most effective ways to gather feedback from the public and audience to then go and build better projects? And what have been the most well-received science communication projects you've made for colleagues and for general public audiences?
Two really separate questions. And I can see why they're linked. You do want to know how people react to I said, be creative was kind of my takeaway point. Be creative in the ways that you feel like you're most creative to share what you know. But you do want to know how that lands. You want to know what the reception is of that. I don't actually think scientists are the best, bench lab field scientists are necessarily the best people for processing and evaluating the reception of what we share. That is probably the role that is better suited for professional educators and social scientists who know how to devise the right kind of surveys and techniques to really understand what people are learning from what you say. So that's just a reminder that one person cannot do everything these days. That's why you have collaborative research teams. If you want to do education outreach properly, you shouldn't work with an educator to answer that question. Now, not everybody has the opportunity to do that. And I didn't write Spying on Whales with that in mind. I had a very narrow window about reaching a specific kind of person. I wanted to reach the kind of person who lived not close to the ocean, but was still interested in it, and who would want to know something about why it is that their taxpayer dollars support my salary to do crazy things like scan fossil whales in the Atacama or tag whales in Antarctica. What narratives pull that together? And for me, writing was a way of pulling those stories together. And this is a way to answer your second question. I think, at least when I hear back from those kinds of readers, people who may have seen a whale once or never in their lives, that said, hey, I read your book and now I understand something. They can repeat a message that was in that book. That's when I feel like the message has been received, and there's that's gratifying. And I do think it's actually like one person at a time. We do change how people think one person at a time. So that's a slow process, but you don't know the effects of changing that one person's view of things. And these can have compounding effects. That other person may actually turn out to be an influencer or share that story very broadly. So it really is not about hitting as broad of an audience, or I think the most valuable thing is to think about who you are trying to reach and an individual person. And for me, that was very useful to think about people I knew in my life who I wanted to reach. And that's true for the medium of writing. Erin has, written as well. For people who do podcasts, that's probably true. For someone like you, Ian, I don't know, maybe you're trying to reach a different audience. And I think there's many different answers that are all legitimate. The point is there's no one answer and there's no one set path. And that's a great thing. We have a lot of room for creative products that can be tested out. I see Ben Moon.
Thanks.
I didn't know there was an ichthyosaur worker in the audience. This sharks and ichthyosaurs.
Thanks for your questions, Catalina and Ian. It's 11 o'clock here in Panama, so we're on the hour. So please feel free to leave if you need to move on to another meeting or something. But otherwise, just stick around and ask more questions for Nick. I'm sure if it's okay with you, Nick.
I have a few more minutes. Yeah.
Great, thanks a lot. There is another question from Ben Moon. If Ben would like to speak it himself, or I can read it out.
Sure. Either or is fine.
I'll go ahead and read it out. So Ben asks, thanks for the great talk. A lot of these most giant marine reptiles are from the Triassic,
Yeah.
and only a few really big species come later. What do you think made this such a great time to grow big, and why other marine reptiles didn't get to those heights?
So if you read the Sander et al. Paper, they spent a lot of time trying to understand something about ocean food webs in terms of productivity in the early Triassic. And this is relatively soon after major mass extinction event in the first few million years. So you have post-disaster recovery ecosystem that is not just different from the Permian, but really different from any of the marine food webs that we know of today in terms of the basic taxonomic groups, the composition of different tiers. Food webs are structured differently in the early Triassic. And I think as much as Sander et al. Wanted to model productivity, we really don't know. It's clearly a non-analogous system with anything that we have at hand for measuring productivity. You know, this is not the Antarctic krill food web. It is not the food webs of the North Pacific, either near shore or offshore. So what was the early Triassic and why do we see so many large predators? It's not just ichthyosaurs, there's other lineages that are fairly large too. So, and there's multi-species community. I mean, you see many large predators and not much supporting them. So where is all that zooplankton that should be supporting large predators? I don't have a good answer. And I don't think, I didn't, full disclosure, I was one of the reviewers for the Sander et al. Paper. And I didn't, they modeled it, but and their model supported what they were trying to show, which is not too surprising. And nobody has a good answer for that, I think. And if you do, I'd love to hear it. But our chances of, I think, getting an answer are going to be really hard because we're just not getting full information from that time period.
Thanks for the question, and thanks, Nick. I have one quick question, Nick. I don't know, I've worked a lot with benthic animals, and you think about the loss of filter feeding whales in the last 100 years compared to pre-industrial whaling,
Yeah.
and how you demonstrated that had a really significant effect on the tightness of nutrient cycling in the oceans. I'm kind of thinking what the knock-on effects of that might be in terms of the benthos. So if you have all of these nutrients that are suddenly finding their way to the seafloor, presumably, rather than being recycled up in the water column, would that potentially be something that could be reflected in the benthic community in terms of numbers of detritivores or something like that, do you think?
For sure. I mean, yeah, and so where would we look for that signal? We'd probably look for core samples from the Bering Sea, maybe a shallow shelf that we know is a diverse, highly productive benthic community that did have was probably under there's probably important selection pressures when you have, 20, 30,000 large mammals that would come and scrape up the seafloor. And when that wasn't there, you suddenly have the release and, like you say, a lot more nutrients that are probably not just suspended, but are just going right into the sediment. The suspension of, there are models, I think, of the suspension of nutrients by gray whales in the Bering Sea. I'm just pulling that example because that's kind of a shallow, tight model. And it's in it's just spectacular numbers because of the abundance of not just whales, but seabirds. And I mean, Bering Sea is one of the most productive ecosystems on the planet in the summer months. So I suspect, I don't know what sedimentation rates are like there, and I don't know whether you could get any information from taking something like a core sample from the Bering Sea. But that would be a good place because we know so much about that ecosystem right now. We might be able to do historical projections within under 100 years. There's not going to be too many other places like that. The seafloor of Monterey Bay and the Channel Islands off the coast of California, they're so deep. They have many more whale skeletons than we realize. I mean, that's a deep sea community, I've thought that with whaling, you actually get the removal of those carcasses as well. So the skeletons and that biomass, 30, 40, 50, 80 tons of biomass is all of a sudden not there on these deep sea communities. What kind of effect does that have? And other people have asked that question as well. And there's no good answer because we really still don't know exactly how deep sea communities are transmitting different larvae across those distances, and whether, is it just a reduced abundance, and so those opportunities for hopping across carcasses on the ocean floor are reduced? Could they still have broadcasted over long distances and it's not a big deal? I don't know. We know the answer to that from a numbers approximation better than we do from the actual natural history, I think, from the sessile point of view. We know about it from like predator down. I'm looking at the Q-Mare logo of holding, was a giant halibut, a flounder or something like that. We know what we've done to large predators because fortunately we have records of what we hunted. And that, it's those kinds of numbers that we used for that baleen whale paper with Matt Savoca's estimates of what the world was like circa 1900 with baleen whales. It was from the whaling statistics that we could actually know, okay, let's say there are this many more whales. What does that mean for biomass? What does that mean for how much prey they actually needed? The numbers of krill that there must have been in the world's ocean, in the Southern Ocean, circa 1900 are many times larger than the krill industry is today. So ocean productivity has dropped in the last, within human memory, right? At least for the Southern Ocean. So we are missing something for sure. That's what I think is really profound about that paper, is that it's for the first time we actually can put numbers on this. And it's not just saying, oh gosh, what were the world's oceans like? They must have been different. This is actually saying how they could have been different. And then what we might recover, should we say, let's try to get these large marine predators back up to numbers where they're not at 5% or 10% of what we think their historical baselines are. And, the lesson, you see this in Ransom Meyer's work and Daniel Pauly's work too, that and many other marine ecologists, if you do these MPAs, fish populations will recover. We do recover those abundances as long as we have no takes implemented. But for mammals, geez, you have such low fecundity and, low numbers to begin with. There are 300 North Atlantic right whales. They're among the biggest filter feeding mammals in the North Atlantic. Gosh, there must have been tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands prior to whaling 1,000 years ago. So yeah, the North Atlantic is probably missing similar productivity in the past.
That's just insane. Thanks so much for your thoughts, Nick. It's really interesting. Rafael has a question. Go ahead, Rafael, if you're like.
Yeah, just a quick question. I guess related to this topic. I'm also working on benthos, so I'm not following the vertebrate literature so closely. But I know that in terrestrial system there are a couple of nice studies showing that the interspecific size distribution on this macroecological, macroevolutionary scales are actually very different right now compared to, for example, Pleistocene before this megafauna extinction. So are there any similar studies on marine systems, like currently the body size or biomass distribution, biomass spectra versus what was 300 years ago, 200 years ago?
So there was a great paper. Aaron knows Doug Macaulay, but one of my favorite Doug Macaulay papers is the one that was in Science about the longer fuse on marine ecosystems versus terrestrial ones. So marine ecosystems are where terrestrial ones were about 200 years ago in terms of abundances and biomass. So we have 200 years before marine ecosystems start looking as defaunated as terrestrial ecosystems do. And that tells you, the change we see just with whales in 100 years tells you just how steep that decline can be. That's not 200 years is not a linear decline in defaunation. That's probably much more geometric than we realize. And it's not like you have, the value of acting sooner rather than later is huge for conservation. And, especially for shifted baselines, it's not about, size tells you a lot, but it's more about abundance, right? If you have the effective disappearance, extinction, yeah, you can have like a few hundred whales left, but they're not in the tens of thousands where that biomass, or hundreds of thousands. I mean, there were 2 to 3 million whales killed in the 20th century, and probably something on the order of 500,000 blue whales, 200,000, 300,000 blue whales. There's not more than about 10,000 blue whales left on the planet right now. So these are animals that are 100 tons apiece. So it's, the amount of nutrient cycling that kind of biomass can do, not to say anything of the carbon storage. I mean, geez, there's a natural climate solution right there. It's not just growing trees, but it's having physiologically active mammals reproduce and sequester that carbon that then gets sunk into the sea floor. I think it's so much. I guess my short answer to your question is that, like, because that delayed fuse, we still have the Pleistocene in the world's oceans, but we're in the process of decimating it. That's what every single marine ecologist is telling us, whether it's about sharks, whales, bony fish. We are in the process of doing that first last glacial maximum cull, right? Like what happened in North America was either blitzkrieg or 1-2 punch. It doesn't matter. The abundance of wild mammal biomass, and we've now replaced that with domesticated mammal mass, which now exceeds the number of wild mammals on the planet. And that's one of the numbers we got from the Matt Savoca paper, was that if you look at the calculations, baleen whales alone in the Southern Ocean were a biomass equivalent to all wild mammals alive right now. So that tells you something about how the world once was, even at the end of the 19th century. So we don't have much time.
Well, in terrestrial system, there's this idea of rewilding. Maybe we should sell, rewilding, whaling the oceans. Yeah.
We say that in the last paragraph of that paper. We say that like this is a rewilding argument. It's a rewilding as a way for a natural climate solution, which is what, gosh, that's what people want these days, I think. And we were fortunate enough to time that paper with the Glasgow COP26 conference, and as soon as that was published, we were like, yeah, get it in the hands of, the John Kerrys of the world to actually point to this as something that is really easy to be done. We know how to protect North Atlantic right whales. The United States actually does it better than any other country. The problem is with climate change, the prey patches are moving into more northern systems. In Canada, there is no Marine Mammal Protection Act, so those large whales are not protected in the same way that they are in the United States. Even in very urban ports and harbors, there are some protection mechanisms, but those don't exist in Canada. And right whales are going up into Canada. So, these whales that survived harsh levels of culling from industrial whaling, North Atlantic right whales, barely made it into the 21st century. And now they're getting hit by cruise ships and cargo ships. That is like an avoidable fate, right? Net entanglement. We can have ropeless traps. They do not have to live lives of incredible suffering. So, but the problem is they're dealing with climate change the way we are. It's happening right now. And our socioeconomic systems are not up to date. So, and it's a transboundary problem too. This is actually where science diplomacy matters. If you want to protect large ocean giants, you need science diplomacy.
Thanks for the question that I've had. Thanks for the answer, Nick.
Good question.
I think, so you haven't advocated yet for domestication of marine mammals.
Very hard to do. hungry animals.
Yeah. Thank you, Nick. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
That was just great.
Thank you for inviting me.
Let me just finish off by mentioning that our next seminar, we have monthly seminars, first Wednesday of every month. Our next seminar is going to be given by Nusabai Rajashu, who is going to be talking about predicting extinction risks, some of her work in corals, presumably, I think, lessons from the past for problems of the future. So please keep an eye out for that. Twitter, the webpage, the Q-Mare webpage, listservs will be announcing that as soon as we have the time and the date fixed. So let me just thank you all for attending, whoever's left, and thank you again, Nick, for this wonderful seminar and a great opportunity to have an overview of your research and how you put it all together in a narrative. It's great.
Thanks so much, Aaron. Thanks to everyone
Yeah.
out there. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye.